Welcome to the Campus Fellowship Podcast. This is our first podcast interview, and we want to highlight for you a resource on our website that we think will be a blessing to your life. My name is Jacob Bennett, and I serve as the Executive Director of Campus Fellowship, which exists to equip local churches in a common mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ on college campuses who worship God and change the world. With me today is Melody Wigdahl. Melody, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Melody. Most people call me Mel. I handle a lot of the media content creation, and I am running the mixer for this podcast and maybe asking some questions too.
Great. And with us also today is Jon Hastings from Vintage Faith Church in Manhattan. Welcome, Jon.
Hey, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, Jon, you recently wrote an article about the rise and triumph of the modern self. But before we get into that, I thought it'd just be good for people to get to know you a little bit, and wanted to figure out how did the Lord call you into ministry?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. So I became a Christian in college, and my freshman year I became a Christian, and I don't know. I had a degree in education and in biology, and I taught for 5 years. But it had always been the plan to go into the ministry. So even from my first year of teaching, I knew I wanted to be a pastor. And I have a bit of a unique story on how that happened. I was reading John 21 one day, and Jesus was talking to Peter and saying, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. And, this doesn't happen often, but the Lord really used that verse powerfully that day in that moment to speak to me and tell me to feed his sheep. And so I don't tell a lot of people to go looking for signs like that. I don't think that's the normal way God necessarily calls people to ministry, but that's the way he did it for me, and it's brought great assurance. And that's ever since then, that's been my pursuit. And by his grace, I'm a pastor today in Manhattan, Kansas. So.
Well, that's wonderful. I can sense that you're a teacher whenever I hear you speak. So that's good to hear. So a little bit about the book that you wrote an article about. And so a little bit about how we're doing this interview is that I've read the article, but Melody has not read the article. So we have both of us asking you questions so that maybe all of our listeners can learn a little bit more and be just motivated to maybe go and read what you've written about this book. So one question I had was, well, what caused you to open it up and crack it open?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hit a period where people were asking me questions, and I would maybe know the right answer, but I wouldn't know why it was the right answer, about how we should live our life and how we should view the world and how the Bible and the gospel applies to every area of life. And so I kind of recognized that I had a deficiency in my worldview, right? Like I knew the end, but I didn't know the whys necessarily. And so there were a couple years there where I just really wanted to form a Christian worldview and know why I believed the things I believed and it didn't believe. And this book had really great reviews on Goodreads. A lot of friends recommended it.
Oh, we love Goodreads.
A few 1 stars from the people that made me think maybe I should read this book, right? And so I decided to crack it open and give it a shot.
That's great. When this book first came out, I devoured it, and my wife, Dina, she loved it as well. And we've recommended it to almost everyone we've talked to. So I wasn't sure if I recommended it to you at some point or not, but I don't think I did. And so I was really surprised when you wrote this article. It's like, yes, this is my favorite book of the last few years. So one thing that you wrote about was a lot of the different thinkers that Carl Trueman walks through, like Rousseau, Darwin, Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, whatever you want to call. Was there any of those thinkers that stood out to you?
Before we dive in, can you guys give me a summary of what
the book is
this
about?
Book? Like, that's
a great
idea. Like a philosophy?
Oh, that's a great
glad to hear, Mel.
Just so I have a general idea.
We're just ready to jump in. I can do that. And Jacob, feel free to fill in the gaps. So this book, the central question that he's asking, he opens up. He says, what this book is about is so Carl Trueman's a historian. He's an historian, right? And so he is trying to outline the history of thought that has led us to the place where a man can say, I am a woman. And if you don't affirm that people look at you like you're kind of crazy, right? And so he tells a story about his grandpa, and he says, in his grandpa's time, if somebody would say that, if a man would say he's a woman, his grandpa would look at them like they're crazy, Now today, which is not that far, right? If you look at them like they're crazy, you're the crazy one. And so he's just trying to understand, how do we get here? How do we get to the point where we're here? Jacob, is that?
Yeah, you hit it right on the head. And I think it's important to know that he's really trying to diagnose culture. Mm-hmm. He doesn't offer a lot of solutions where to go, but it's a great diagnosis of culture.
Yeah.
So considering that, great question, Mel. Of the different thinkers, which one really, as he was explaining them, maybe struck you?
Yeah. I've been most struck by Rousseau's impact on culture. I think, Rousseau, he read Augustine's Confessions, and Augustine has this scene in the Confessions, I don't know if you've ever read it, where he steals some pears with his friends, right? Anybody? Some nods?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
And he says he realizes afterwards he didn't even eat the pear. He wasn't hungry. He just threw the pear and let it rot. And he go later on, he diagnoses why he stole the pear. Why did he sin? As because he wanted to, basically. He was sinful in and of himself, right? He wanted to sin even outside of wanting the pear. It wasn't because he was hungry. Rousseau reads that same story, and he has a similar story in his own life. And he says, why did I steal? Why did I do that thing? He says, it's because I wanted to please my friends. It's because there were these outside social pressures that led me to do this wrong thing. And Rousseau uses that as an example, and he develops it into this idea that, mankind are basically good. Mankind is basically at their core good, but because of all the pressures of society, we do bad things. Does that make sense? And this is where his idea of noble savage comes from, right? If you could find a savage that is free from civilization's impacts, they would be a good, noble person. And that I think our world has swallowed that hook, line, and sinker. And it can when we understand that was his idea, and we understand its implications in societies, I think it makes a lot of things make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing, so in his book, he draws a distinction between traditional cultures that he calls mimetic, where people get their identity from the people around them, and more modern cultures that he terms poietic. And he's borrowing these terms from elsewhere, but poietic, where the identity of a person comes from within. Could you elaborate more on that? Because I feel like that's a very central theme of his throughout the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, as I've talked to you about this, Jacob, we have historically, and you maybe even know this better than me, so chime in, but, historically, mankind has mostly received their identity. If your dad was a blacksmith, you could guess you were going to be a blacksmith, right? Mm-hmm. It's something that was accepted, and, arranged marriages were, more normal in ancient cultures. And so I think, that's kind of what he's getting at, is this idea of receiving, living within your culture, not necessarily trying to push the boundaries. The honorable way of life is to not push the boundaries, right? And then in the modern day culture, the honorable way of life is to find your own way.
Right.
The honorable way is to not go with the flow. You're inauthentic, in fact, if you just go with the flow. And the way to be truly authentic and to truly have honor is to create your own path, your own identity, who you are.
Right. And so maybe the flip side of that would be, in a mimetic culture, traditional culture, you conform to what other people call you to be. And in a modern culture, poietic, the world around you conforms to what you say you are. Would you say that's...
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly what you're saying.
Yep.
So as Christians, what should we do? Should we affirm modern or traditional identity formations?
Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. It seems to me like our culture has swung so far into the poetic, that, I say poetic, I don't mean I don't mean writing poetry, right? They've sung so far in that direction of individualistic, make your own identity, go your own way. You know what I mean? All the Disney narratives, that voice that's inside you is who you are, right? No rules for me, I'm free. If you're a Frozen fan like me of 3 daughters, okay? We've swung so far in that direction that I think it would be wise of us to really think long and hard about the benefits of receiving your identity and not just creating your identity, right? So I think in general, the scriptures teach us that our identity is something that we receive from God. It's something that's given to us, and that's actually a huge blessing. It's actually not, it's not a restraint. It's given to us for our good and helps us to know how to live our lives, what obligations we have and don't have, what's good and what's bad, what decisions we shouldn't make, right? It helps us to live our lives. But I do think it can go too far. I think there were some real things they were pushing against with the individualistic culture. So,
yeah, and that is very important to understand, know that our identity as Christians is a received identity. And I think, that Christianity even balances both, that not only do we receive an identity, but we receive a personhood from God.
Yeah.
And that Christianity holds both in a tension that without Christ, without God, it seems like the world is just going to go from one to the other.
And I think one of the major themes of Scripture is that we were all, in a sense, we all received this identity of enslaved to sin when we're born, right? We're in a sense, we're in the world, and Jesus came to set us free from that, right? That's kind of a poetic concept almost, right? Poetic concept, however you say that word, is that he came to deliver us from this received identity of enslaved to sin and dead in our sin, and really make us who we were always meant to be, right? Children of God. And so in that sense, I think there is some poetic elements to the gospel of really setting us free to be who we were always meant to be. Yeah.
Great. Well, Jon, you end your article talking about the role of the church to have compassion on people who've bought into the lies of our culture about their identity. And I just thought it'd be good to ask you, how can the normal everyday Christian do this on their college campus or in their workplace, in a culture where they say, I don't feel loved when you don't affirm the identity that I've chosen?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is that you really do have compassion. And I think that for me, at least one of the things that I've experienced is I have way more compassion when I understand where they're coming from. So if I'm afraid of a viewpoint that, oh gosh, maybe it's right, or I don't really understand, but don't ask me too many questions about it. So, you know what I mean? I can just move on. This is the right answer. And when I don't understand why people hold the views they hold, it's much more difficult for me to actually have compassion. And so I think that's what I love most about Carl Trueman's book is as I was reading it, I was like, oh man, I believe these are lies. I believe Rousseau was lying. I believe Marx is a lie. I believe Freud, that we're basically sexual beings. I think those are lies. But they're actually, those authors, they're super compelling. Like it's easy to believe those things. There are some things that they say that are convincing, and that led me to understand why somebody would be convinced by that, why they would believe freedom is to be found here, you know what I'm saying, in these views. And when I really understand why they believe that and that they're looking for freedom and they're looking for authenticity and joy, I think understanding that actually cultivated a true compassion in me. And that's really the most important thing, right? I'm actually not sure that we can convince our culture that we love them. Even if we really do love them, we actually have compassion, right? Because the most loving thing I can do, I truly believe this, the most loving thing I can do is to not post my pronouns on Instagram. You know what I'm saying? Like by posting those pronouns, what I'm doing is I'm affirming that worldview. I'm saying you actually might not know if I'm a boy or a girl, so I'm going to post these so that you'll know, and it's affirming the worldview that your identity is something that can be molded and created at will. And affirming that identity actually leads to an incredible amount of pain and suffering. So the most loving thing I believe I can do is not post those pronouns. And I think someday I'm going to stand before God and I'm going to give an account for that. And praise God, He judges by the heart. And so if I truly have compassion and I truly love and I'm truly wanting their good by not doing that, I think that's the most important thing,
Yeah.
And by God's grace, maybe some in the trans community will see, no, I think he actually loves me. He's not calling me by this name, he's not doing this or that or the other, but I actually think maybe he really loves me. And I think that would just have to be by God's grace. I'm not sure there's anything we can do outside of telling them I love you, but I'm not sure they would believe us to convince them. So,
yeah. Well, we certainly need a lot of wisdom and discernment from the Lord to know how to navigate a lot of these tricky cultural waters and obey Christ and all he's commanded us. So, Jon, thank you so much for joining us and for highlighting this article. Listeners, if you found this conversation stimulating for your faith, you can look at the show notes and there will be a link to the article. And I think Jon and I would both also recommend that you buy the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, or if you want the shorter version, A Strange New World, and read it for yourself.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us.
Campus Fellowship is a student organization designed to come alongside local churches to reach college campuses. If you found this encouraging, we invite you to subscribe or follow for more content, or go to our website, campusfellowship.com, for other resources. Thanks for listening.